Most of us, as individuals, pay tax, but many big companies don't. Now, a landmark deal aims to stop corporate tax dodging. G7 nations agreed to set a minimum rate. Will it force the multinationals to pay their fair share? And who will benefit? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. Do business in one country, shift the profits to an offshore haven and pay little or no corporate tax? It's controversial, but the world's biggest companies have been doing this for years. Now, the G7 group of so-called advanced economies, the leading industrial nations, are trying to stop the practice. It's agreed to set a minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. Some of the multinational firms targeted include Amazon, Facebook and Google. Now, they've been criticised for exploiting global tax loopholes while reaping huge profits, not least during the pandemic. Now, we'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Niamh Barker in London.
Tax rarely gets pulses racing, but after 2 days of mast-to-mast talks in London, a commitment by G7 finance ministers to force some of the richest companies in the world into paying their fair share.
Well, I'm delighted to announce that today, after years of discussion, G7 finance ministers have reached a historic agreement to reform the global tax system, to make it fit for the global digital age, but crucially to make sure that it's fair.
Many countries are desperate to plug holes in their finances caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. While many nations have been sinking deeper into debt, the pandemic was a windfall for big tech companies such as Amazon and Google that raked in huge profits. At the moment, companies are billed on their earnings in the countries where they operate. But this old way of doing things is no longer fit for purpose, largely because it's exploited widely by multinational companies that operate in various different competing tax zones. All they need to do is declare their profits where the tax is at its lowest, or indeed where there are no taxes at all. And it's all completely legal. But G7 finance ministers say now's the time to level the playing field by introducing a flat 15% rate on businesses to help pay back pandemic debt.
That global minimum tax would end the race to the bottom in corporate taxation and ensure fairness for the middle class and working people in the US and around the world.
Tax evasion will be more difficult for big companies all over the world, and this is a good message for the people of our countries, and especially the big tech giants will have to pay their fair share.
Google, that's been bracing for a global tax hike for some time, said it strongly supported the work being done to update international tax rules, and it hopes countries continue to work together to ensure a balanced and durable agreement will be finalised soon. While Facebook said it wanted the international tax reform process to succeed, while recognising it could mean paying more tax in different places. The big challenge now comes with getting enough economies on board to make the plan work, including countries such as Ireland, where low corporate tax rates have enticed several big businesses, including Google, to build their European headquarters there. What's good for the G7 may not satisfy all. Talks will continue at the G20 summit later this year. Niamh Barker, Al Jazeera, London.
Let's look at why tech firms such as Amazon, Google and Facebook have been accused of dodging taxes. Well, all have their headquarters in the United States. Amazon reported a profit of $20 billion in America last year. It paid 9% of that in taxes, well below the official corporate rate of 21%. Its European division, based in Luxembourg, paid no corporate taxes at all. In 2017, Google was accused of moving nearly $23 billion to a shell company in Bermuda to reduce its foreign tax bill. And last year, the US tax agency sued Facebook to claw back $9 billion in unpaid taxes, but the trial was cancelled due to the pandemic. So let's bring in our guest for this edition of Inside Story. In Athens, we have Mansour, spokesman for the Tax Justice Network. In Abuja, Nigeria, Mustapha Ndajiwo, who's executive director of the African Centre for Tax and Governance. And in New Haven, Pogge, professor of philosophy and politics at Yale University and author of Global Tax Fairness. Welcome, gentlemen, all to the programme. Mr Pogge, can I come to you first in New Haven? The G7 seem to be banging their own drum that they've achieved and agreed in principle on levelling tax loopholes. I mean, are they singing their own praises far too early?
Well, it is a bit early in the day. This is obviously progress, but there are a lot of problems still to be ironed out. The agreement is among 7 countries, and we have more than 200 tax jurisdictions in the world, many of which have zero taxes or taxes below the 15%. And so the first question is whether it will be possible to get everybody onto the same sheet, everybody up to 15%, or whether some of the traditional tax havens will try to resist that. Another problem is that even above the 15%, you have a lot of variation in tax rates. And so even if everybody has at least 15%, there is still a problem of corporations trying to go shopping for cheaper tax rates, trying to pay 15 rather than 30, 35, or even up to 50 in some jurisdictions.
Yeah. That gives us an overview, certainly, of how this conversation is going to go. Mark Mansour in Athens, I know you have a very specific angle and why we've invited you onto the programme, but in general, is this all about sort of corporate tax dodging? I mean, can you see this as a potential first step to tightening the rules and more countries coming on board with the idea of 15%, though they might not actually like it right now?
Well, the way I would summarize it is the G7 this weekend has pushed the international tax system into the 21st century, but only just for themselves. Only the G7 will see the main benefits of what was announced this weekend, leaving the rest of the world behind.
Thomas Pogge, in New Haven, can I just come back to you then very quickly? Has the US sort of wanted initially 21%, but came down in this negotiation in the UK with the other G7 finance ministers? So why settle just for 15? Is it enough to keep both American industry and global capitals happy at the moment?
Yeah, I guess that is one of the reasons for keeping it at 15, right? Obviously, it's heavy lifting to get it up to 15 in the first place. The US, as you may know, is trying to increase its corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. And a 28% tax rate would be very difficult to maintain. It would be difficult to keep corporations paying that tax rate if they can, by profit shifting, get 0% tax rate or 5% tax rate in some other jurisdiction. So 15% makes it a little bit more realistic for the US to collect on its 28%.
It seems that the developed countries, Mustapha and Ndajiwo in Abuja, Nigeria, seem to have it all sewn up, that they have all the answers. But do they have the answers for Africa? I mean, what concerns you about the agreement that's been made now, initially by the G7 countries?
Thank you for having me. So yes, first of all, the question is who designs these rules and who are these rules designed for? Like you rightly said, for the argument has always been that a group of few elite countries have been designing these rules without taking into consideration the peculiarities affecting other countries. For example, developing countries like African countries, like our countries, Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, Kenya, and the rest. So there is a big political question as to whether or not we want to continue in a system that is bullish, because as far as we're concerned, 7 countries cannot come up with a global tax rule. And that is why we've been clamoring for a global tax body under the United Nations.
And of course, Mark Mansour, let me just bring you in there. Based on that, your chief executive, Alex Cobham, who's written widely on this decision, has talked about, the G7 shamelessly benefiting themselves and leaving the rest of the world behind. He then goes on to talk about what the plan would be and the modelling from your organisation, that maybe as much as 355 billion might be generated as a fairer approach under the 15% system. Maybe only 100 billion might be available for poorer countries. So the question then is, it seems that from the analysis, that it's the fat cats and the richer economies that are going to keep the coffers very close, you might say, to themselves. And the real losers are the poor countries like Africa, maybe parts of Asia as well, and Southern America. Who do you see as the biggest losers in all of this?
Well, sadly, again, it is lower income countries. Lower income countries aren't just getting a fraction of the taxes are going to be recovered by the global rate announced. But to lower income countries, corporate taxes play more important role in funding public services. Of global tax abuse today, corporate tax abuse, lower income countries may lose less total tax than richer income countries, but that tax is a much bigger share of their public health services and other government revenue. Altogether, lower income countries lose the equivalent of just over half their combined public health spending to global tax abuse every year. So for the G7 to come out with this really shameless proposal that is not just unambitious by setting such a low minimum tax rate of 15%, to then take 60% or so of the recovered taxes just to 7 countries where 10% of the global population lives is incredibly shameless, especially during a time like this, during a pandemic when lower income countries and the rest of the world really was looking to the G7 to put their weight behind an international tax system that would bring back billions in tax home to the countries from which it was robbed and which those countries urgently need to rebuild and recover.
Indeed, I mean, Mustapha, in Abuja, it does seem that the poorer countries, if what Mark is saying and what's reflected by the organisation that he represents, are going to be hard hit as such. Do you think poorer countries, maybe in Africa, will have their arms twisted to join the system and to join the debate and then try within that system themselves as independent states to push the developed countries, to push the richer countries to increase that tax rate? What's your opinion about whether there is enough clout in Africa to be able to push the United States, to push the G7, to push Japan?
Well, I mean, like we all know, it's a power play, right? So saying that African countries, whether or not we have the muscle, I would say, no, we don't have the muscle. I mean, history has proven that. And looking at all the conversations, all the rules that have been said before now, the OECD, through the inclusive framework, tried to make the global tax setting more inclusive. However, we still have a lot to achieve, because it is one thing to be at the table, but it's also another thing to be able to set the agenda. So although African countries are making efforts, particularly through the African Tax Administration Forum, in terms of whether or not we have the muscle to actually achieve our own goals, I really doubt that.
Can I then ask you, a country like South Africa, which is part of BRICS, which is an internal financial grouping which includes Brazil, India, Russia and China. I mean, South Africa is seen as a bit of a heavyweight on the continent. Do you think that within a system like BRICS or its membership of maybe ECOWAS or the African Union, they can, as a group, as an entity, is there any way politically, do you think, that they can make some sort of influence, can talk to the G7 in a way that would represent Africa and to try and persuade them that they need to help Africa a lot more?
So I haven't seen anything on the AU front. However, like I mentioned, under the African Tax Administration Forum, which South Africa is also a member, I know that South Africa and Nigeria are very actively involved with ATAF. And they have made some very significant progress recently in terms of pursuing the African agenda. However, in terms of implementing and agreeing to these rules, we haven't really seen anything concrete. So it is one thing to be hopeful, but like I said, it is highly unlikely that African countries, whether South Africa or Nigeria, are really able to do anything. And that is, I mean, it is evident that in what the G7 has done recently, because it's like saying, we are the G7, we're coming up with these proposals, whether you like it or not, you'll have to take it, because if you've already set the agenda, you've set the framework, it's really difficult for countries because these things, they're not just tax rules. They go into trade issues, trade deals, issues of transfer of capital. So there are a lot of things to consider, and that's why the G7, the likes of G7 countries have the upper hand.
Thomas Pogge in New Haven, can I just bring you in here? Because if we talk of Africa and countries in Africa being losers, there's actually quite a few countries in the Northern Hemisphere that will also be losers, such as Ireland and perhaps France. If you look at Ireland's corporate tax rate of 12.5% does attract a lot of big business. We know that companies like Google, I think, and Facebook have their headquarters in Dublin and in their local surroundings. France has a corporate tax charge of 31%. In that conversation amongst the G7 finance ministers, I wonder what's going through the French finance minister's mind when he's agreeing to 15% as a new corporate rate when France itself charges 31%. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think that there is probably pressure from both sides. On the one hand, of course, the rich countries want this minimum tax rate to be close to their own because they don't want to lose corporate taxation. But on the other hand, and that's also a very important consideration, many of the multinational corporations who are the taxpayers are headquartered in and owned by citizens of these rich countries. So rich countries so far have been quite willing to let these corporations get away with paying very few taxes or maybe even no taxes at all, because the benefit accrued to their own citizens, who would then, if you're lucky, pay some taxes, but at the very least would give campaign contributions to the political parties in the rich countries, in particular in the United States.
Indeed. Do you think they're going to have a difficult time, for example, France, Germany and Italy, who are part of the G7, of trying to sell this back to their own EU partners? If we just look at the EU, for example, 27 member states, and 3 of them are actually in the G7. What does this say to countries like Lithuania and where Mark is in Athens, Greece? They're not rich countries.
Right, but I think that they can certainly persuade the European countries, that a few European countries that have tax rates below 15%, they would have to adjust. Hungary is one example. But I think on the whole, this is a deal that is doable within the EU and is generally beneficial to the EU. I think, maybe a little bit in contrast to what the other speakers have said, I think this is, on the whole, a good step. It's a very weak step, and absolutely more has to be done. But what we now are committed to, what everybody understands, is that tax sovereignty has to be tempered by fairness, and taxes in one country have effects on the tax income of other countries. There is a tax competition, and you can't just have every country do their own tax system without regard to how that affects populations in other countries. So this is a small step, it's too little, but I think we are going in the right direction of understanding that we need to coordinate globally and find a fair tax system that makes sure that the benefits of corporate taxation are reaching all populations.
OK, gentlemen, just hold it there. I've got some more information to give our viewers at home, because tax avoidance and evasion cost governments billions of dollars. Research from Poland suggests the European Union member states lose nearly $190 billion a year. The Tax Foundation, a US-based think tank, believes that multinational firms have stashed away up to $700 billion in taxes in offshore havens. And the charity ActionAid says poorer countries are missing out on nearly $3 billion in taxes from Facebook, Google and Microsoft. So I want to come back to you, Mark Mansour, in Athens. We mentioned that obviously the big companies like Amazon and Google were quite warmly responsive to the decision made by the G7 finance ministers. Were you surprised by that?
I just want to clarify. I just want to add more to the statistics said about how much tax is launched each year, just to make that concrete, because those figures are so large. We estimate every second the world loses the equivalent of a nurse's yearly salary to a tax haven. So when you're talking about those big numbers, what those mean in practice, it's a year's worth of a salary for a nurse lost each second to a tax haven. So, I mean, it's not too surprising to hear that coming from corporations. Of course, publicly, they're going to come and support. And for years, these organizations have been saying that they have been paying tax where it's due. But of course, in practice, that has not been the case. It's worth keeping in mind that 15%, what the G7 have done is basically keep the race to the bottom alive. So we've known for 40 years that the race to the bottom is damaging. There's been a ton of research on this. It damages economies, it damages well-being, people's well-being, and it creates inequality. The G7 finally this week admitted that. But what they've done by just setting the rate at 15% is they're saying they're happy to keep that race to bottom intact. So yeah, it's not surprising. Okay. And on the subject, sorry.
No, that's not. I just want to bring in Mustapha and Ndajiwo in Abuja, because Mustapha, obviously, you know, so much money lost in the system. What sort of money could a nurse's salary, say, of $13,000 or $20,000 do for a community if it was taxed in Abuja or somewhere else that you can give us a relevant example for? Yeah,
so we've carried out some studies and looking at tax incentives, you know, which the global minimum tax rate is trying to address. We've seen that from only one company getting tax holidays, they were able to save about 100 billion naira, just one company over the course of 5 years. And the estimates that we've seen is that these 100 billion naira can actually build over 2,500 primary healthcare centers, well-equipped primary healthcare centers. So in terms of what $20,000 can do, looking at it from the public health perspective, I think it would go a long way in equipping a primary healthcare center.
Yeah, and I think Mark was agreeing with you there, certainly in Athens. But I want to come back to Thomas here in New Haven, because it's a unique opportunity that's arisen in these, last 36 hours as those finance ministers got together to agree on how to, you might say, recoup lost money and to help rebuild their economies. I mean, would this situation and this development and this agreement have happened if there hadn't been a change in leadership in the White House and a global pandemic at the same time?
So I'm pretty sure it would not have happened, and not with Trump. And Trump would basically have pursued an America First policy, trying to not do it multilaterally, but individually try to get as much money out of corporations as possible for the United States, insofar as he even would have wanted that money. As I said before, in many cases, the American elites, or at least the Republican elites, are better off collecting less money from corporations and more in campaign contributions rather than get taxes for the country.
OK, we're coming to the end of the programme. Nearly. Mark Mansour, I'd like to come to you in Athens now. In the light of what's actually happened over, the last 24, 36 hours, how do you see the move now progressing, and the conversation, not just amongst sort of, you might say, the northern and southern hemispheres, but from countries as far wide as New Zealand to India, from Taiwan to the Philippines, who in fact all have, for example, a Facebook head office or a regional centre there, and all have different tax scenarios. It's a very large debate for the future, isn't it? And it's not one that's going to be solved overnight.
I agree, and I would agree with Mustapha on this. It's not just our international tax system that has been shown to be unfit. It's a process we have for setting international tax rules. Yesterday, 7 countries, the richest countries in the world, laid out a plan for the rest of the world, and that plan sees them taking a larger share of larger slice of the pie than they ought to from recovered tax. The OECD, which has put forward a proposal that the G7 appears to be supporting, will disproportionately give OECD countries first dibs on any recovered tax. So it's not just the international tax system that's not working, it's our process. What we need is to move international tax rules to the UN and to set up a UN tax convention. And that approach hasn't just been recommended by the high-level UN FACTI panel. Just this week, the World Economic Forum signaled that approach as well. So going forward, the path is to bring international tax rules into the daylight of democracy at the UN.
It's an interesting conversation that I'm sure we will be revisiting in the future. For the moment, we have to leave it there, I'm afraid. But I'd like to thank you all, Mark Mansour in Athens, Mustapha and Ndajiwo in Abuja, Nigeria, and Thomas Pogge in New Haven. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you for watching as well. You can see this and all of our previous programmes again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ inside story. From me, Sohail, Rahman. Until next time, from the whole team here, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.